I smoothed my dress, expecting admiration as I entered the ballroom. Instead, the air curdled. I showed up to my husband's law firm opening party, only to hear people snickering. "The starter wife is here." Then he smirked, sliding an envelope to me. "Congrats. Our first case is our divorce. Sign and leave." So I smiled, walked out, and quietly revoked the $12 million credit line I'd secured for his firm. Minutes later, my phone blew up with 289 missed calls, and his senior partner showed up at my door. Let's rewind 40 minutes to when I stood under the crystal chandelier. Julian looked like a king on that stage, clutching a microphone in one hand and his new associate's waist with the other. He didn't just hand me the papers, he made a show of it. The heavy cream envelope felt like lead. The crowd, filled with people whose mortgages I had effectively paid, held their breath. They wanted a scene. They wanted tears. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a single drop. Julian's smirk faltered when I pulled a Montblanc pen from my clutch. He expected begging, or perhaps a scream that would prove I was unstable. Instead, I uncapped the pen and pressed the nib to the paper on the hors d'oeuvre table. The ink flowed black, severing 10 years of marriage in 3 seconds. I handed the folder back with a genuine, terrifying smile. "Thank you," I whispered. His eyes narrowed, finally sensing a trap he couldn't quite see yet. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, silencing the laughter instantly. The cold Chicago wind hit my face, drying the sweat of performance. I didn't cry. I didn't hail a cab. I simply pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. The interface glowed with a comforting green light. There it was at the top. The Sterling account. It looked like firm capital to everyone else, but the fine print knew better. It was a personal guarantor line linked solely to my credit rating. Julian thought he was independent. He forgot that I paid for the lease on the copiers and the servers hosting his client files. My thumb hovered over the "Revoke Access" button. I didn't just pause the funds, I flagged the activity as unauthorized use by third party. This triggered an immediate fraud recall. I tapped confirm. A loading wheel spun for a heartbeat, then turned into a green check mark. Miles away, inside the ballroom, a credit card terminal declined with a sharp, angry beep. I settled into the leather seat of my rideshare as the chaos began. My screen lit up with the first call from the catering manager, followed by Julian. I silenced them both. By the time I reached my apartment, the notifications were a solid wall of panic. I poured a glass of wine and kicked off my heels, waiting for the inevitable. Then came the pounding on my front door. It wasn't my husband. It was Arthur Vance, the senior partner, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Arthur stood on my mat, his silk tie loosened and sweat beading on his forehead. The man who usually commanded boardrooms now looked like a shipwreck survivor. "Emma, the firm's accounts are frozen," he rasped, ignoring my wine glass. I didn't invite him in. I simply leaned against the doorframe, watching a vein throb in his temple. Julian said it was a glitch, but the bank mentioned fraud. He looked desperate. The power had shifted from the ballroom to my hallway. "It is not a glitch, Arthur," I said, my voice like dry velvet. "I reported the line as compromised because it is." He flinched at the word. The $12 million credit line was the firm's lifeblood, used to leverage every pending merger. Without it, Their checks to vendors and staff would bounce by morning. He tried to step forward, but I remained a solid barrier. He wasn't talking to a wife anymore. He was talking to the woman who owned his infrastructure. Julian is a fool. But don't sink the firm. Arthur pleaded, his voice dropping an octave. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather folder. It contained a panicked summary of their liabilities. We have 3 trials starting Monday. If the servers go dark, we lose everything. I took the folder and scanned the numbers. Julian had spent $300,000 on client acquisition in a month. I knew that money had actually bought a Cartier watch for his mistress. I tossed the folder back onto his chest. Julian used my signature to fund his adultery. That violates the primary guarantor agreement. Arthur's eyes widened as he realized I had been collecting receipts for months. He thought he could bully me into submission with legal jargon. Instead, he found a forensic auditor in a cocktail dress. The realization hit him hard. The firm wasn't just broke. It was legally exposed to a massive fraud investigation if I didn't stop the recall. "What do you want?" he asked, defeated. I didn't answer immediately. I walked to my side table and picked up a tablet. I pulled up the firm's real estate lease. Julian thinks he is a partner. I want him gone. Arthur shook his head, stammering about bylaws and seniority. You don't understand, Arthur. I didn't just provide the credit. My shell company bought the title to your office building last June. The man nearly collapsed. I was now his landlord too. Arthur grabbed the doorframe to steady himself. The subtext was finally clear to him. I wasn't just a disgruntled ex-wife seeking a settlement. I was a hostile entity executing a total takeover. If he resigns tonight, I might consider a temporary bridge loan, I offered. It was a lie. But it kept him on the hook. He checked his watch, his hands shaking. I'll call the board. We'll strip his equity. He turned to leave. His dignity left on my rug. I closed the door and felt the silence return. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a call. It was a security alert from my doorbell camera. Julian was sitting in his car at the curb, staring up at my window. He looked small in the yellow street lamp glow, but the engine was still idling. The low hum felt like a threat. Then, my screen flickered with a new notification. A large withdrawal had just been attempted from my personal savings account. Someone had my private emergency backup codes. I stared at the phone screen as the withdrawal notification pulsed red. My private emergency codes were supposed to be ironclad. Julian was still sitting in his car outside, but he wasn't looking at his phone. He was staring at the front door with a hollow, predatory intensity. I realized then that he had anticipated my financial strike. He hadn't just used me for credit. He had been mining my personal data for months. He was inside my vault. The pressure mounted as a second alert chirped. Another $50,000 vanished into a blind offshore account. I scrambled to my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys to initiate a hard lockdown. I had to sever his access before he drained the liquid assets I needed for my own survival. The screen flickered with a warning message. My master password had been changed from a secondary device. He had locked me out of my own life. I grabbed my coat and headed for the back exit. I couldn't stay in the apartment if he had the digital keys to the security system. As I reached the kitchen, The smart lights suddenly flared to a blinding intensity, and then died. The electronic lock on the back door hummed, deadbolting itself with a metallic snap. I was trapped inside a cage of my own design. Julian wasn't just losing. He was trying to take me down with him. "Emma, let's talk about the credit line." A voice crackled through the intercom. It was Julian, his tone eerily calm and devoid of his earlier panic. He wasn't in the car anymore. He was using the building's guest interface to speak directly into my sanctuary. I stood in the dark kitchen, the smell of ozone lingering from the surged bulbs. He knew I was listening. He knew I was scared. He wanted the $12 million back tonight. I reached into the utility drawer and found my physical override key. It was a low-tech solution for a high-tech betrayal. I jammed it into the manual release of the pantry door, which led to the service elevator. As the door creaked open, I saw a shadow move in the hallway. It wasn't Julian. It was the associate from the party, the mistress. She held a tablet and looked terrified. "He's lost his mind, Emma," she whispered. She stepped into the dim light of the pantry. Her Armani suit was wrinkled, and her eyes were wide with genuine shock. "He's trying to transfer everything to a crypto wallet before the firm's board can freeze his assets," she explained quickly. She showed me her screen. She had been the one helping him set up the accounts, but the scale of his theft had finally broken her loyalty. She wanted out. She offered me her admin credentials. I took the tablet, our fingers brushing for a brief, cold second. With her login, I could override Julian's lockout and reclaim my savings. I worked quickly, my breath hitching as I redirected the final transfer back to my primary holding. The digital tide turned, and the money flowed home. I looked up to thank her, but she was already backing away toward the service stairs. She pointed at the tablet. "Check the last folder," she said. I tapped the hidden folder. My blood turned to ice. Inside lay hundreds of scanned documents from my family's private trust. Julian had been forging my father's signature for months. He wasn't just stealing my present. He was harvesting my family's legacy. He had already siphoned millions from the foundation. The service elevator groaned nearby. I ducked into the dark corner of the pantry. The tablet screen cast a blue glow on my shaking hands. I needed to export these files to the authorities now. Julian's heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. He was closer than I originally thought. I hit the sync button. The progress bar crawled forward. Julian began pounding on the kitchen door. The wood groaned under his rage. "Emma, I know you are in there," he screamed. His voice sounded distorted through the thick timber. The tablet flickered with a low battery warning. The lock clicked open. I held my breath as the kitchen light flooded the pantry floor. Julian stood there, disheveled and sweating. He held a heavy brass award from the gala. He looked like a man who had lost his soul. He didn't see me in the shadows. "Where is she?" Julian muttered. He walked toward the living room, swinging the trophy. I saw my chance to bolt toward the stairs. I clutched the tablet to my chest like a shield. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stepped onto the cold concrete of the staircase. I reached the lobby, gasping for air. The security guard was gone. The front glass door was shattered. A black sedan sat idling at the curb with the lights off. A man stepped out of the shadows. He held a badge. "Emma Sterling. We need the tablet." I gripped the tablet tighter, as the wind whipped through the shattered lobby doors. The man with the badge didn't move toward me. He remained by the idling sedan, his shadow stretching across the glass shards. "I am Detective Miller, Financial Crimes," he said, his voice level. I didn't trust the timing. Julian had been forging signatures for months. This could be a setup. I checked the street for the security guard. The booth was empty and dark. "I have the evidence of the forgeries," I said, keeping the tablet behind my back. Miller took a step into the pale street lamp light. He looked exhausted, his suit jacket rumpled from a long shift. "We know about the trust siphoning, Emma. We have been tracking the offshore movements since October." My heart skipped. They had watched him steal from my father, and said nothing. I felt a surge of cold fury. They were using me as bait. "If you knew, why did you let him serve me those papers tonight?" I demanded. Miller looked down at the sidewalk. "We needed the final transfer to be initiated from a known device. You triggered the trap when you revoked the credit line. He wanted the tablet because it held the encrypted keys to the receiver accounts. I was the key to his entire case. Without me, Julian was just a thief. With me, he was a felon." A sudden crash echoed from the stairwell behind me. Julian had found the service exit. He stumbled into the lobby. His brass award still clutched in a white, knuckled grip. He stopped when he saw the detective and the sedan. The rage in his eyes turned to a frantic, cornered panic. "She stole the firm's money, detective," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. He was still trying to spin the lie. He looked pathetic. Miller didn't even look at Julian. He kept his eyes on me, holding out a hand for the device. "Emma, give me the tablet. Let us handle this now." I looked at Julian, then at the man promising justice. I realized Miller didn't care about my family's legacy. He only cared about the conviction. If I handed it over, the trust money might be frozen in litigation for years. I had to make a choice. I didn't hand it over. Instead, I tapped the screen one last time, initiating a protocol the mistress had shown me. It was a remote backup command that secured the local data to my private server before wiping the tablet clean. "The evidence is already with my lawyers," I lied. Julian lunged forward, the brass trophy swinging in a desperate arc. Miller moved fast, intercepting him with a heavy shoulder. They hit the marble floor together with a sickening thud. Julian groaned, pinned beneath the detective's weight. The trophy skittered across the floor, ringing like a bell. I backed toward the street, my eyes fixed on the man who had been my husband. He looked up at me, his lip bleeding, pleading for a mercy I no longer possessed. Miller reached for his handcuffs. Then, a second black sedan pulled up behind the first one. Two men in expensive suits stepped out. They weren't police. They were my father's executors. The executors stood like granite statues against the flickering city lights. Julian lay pinned under the detective, his breathing a series of wet, ragged gasps. I clutched the tablet, watching as the senior executor, Elias, stepped forward. He held a crimson folder embossed with my father's seal. The air felt heavy with the smell of exhaust and old money. Elias didn't look at Julian or the police. He looked only at me. "The audit is complete, Emma," he stated. His voice was finality itself. Elias opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of vellum. "Julian didn't just forge signatures, Emma. He attempted to use the family trust as collateral for a private loan. My stomach twisted into a knot. This went beyond embezzlement. He had tried to mortgage my father's legacy to fund his mistress and his ego. Julian let out a choked sound, trying to twist away from Miller's grip. I was going to pay it back, he hissed. Nobody believed him. He was a sinking ship. Detective Miller stood up, dragging Julian with him. He's going downtown, Miller said, his eyes scanning the executors with professional suspicion. But the tablet stays with me as evidence. I looked at Elias, seeking a sign. The executor shook his head slowly. The detective is correct about the law. But he is wrong about the ownership. Elias handed me a second document. It was a power of attorney signed by my father, just days before he passed. It gave me total control over any digital evidence. I felt the weight of the document in my hand. The paper was cool and thick. Julian's eyes widened as he realized my father had suspected him all along. He knew. Julian whispered, his face pale in the strobe of the police lights. He knew you were a parasite. I replied. I stepped toward Miller and held out the vellum. You get the tablet after I purge the personal data. Miller hesitated, but Elias stepped into his personal space. The dynamic was shifting. You have 5 minutes. Miller grunted, stepping back. I sat on the edge of the fountain, the cold marble biting through my dress. My fingers flew across the screen. I saw the map of Julian's greed. He had moved money through 12 different shells. It was a masterpiece of deception. I began the irreversible decision. I wasn't just purging data. I was rerouting the final $12 million back into the foundation. I hit the execution command. The progress bar hummed. Julian began to scream then, a sound of pure, unadulterated loss. He knew that once those funds moved, his leverage vanished. He would have nothing left for a legal defense. The senior partner, Arthur, pulled up in a taxi, stumbling out into the glass-strewn lobby. He saw Julian in cuffs and me with the tablet. Emma, we can settle this, Arthur shouted. He looked older than he had an hour ago. He saw the crimson folder. He knew the executors were here. There is no settlement for fraud, Arthur, I said without looking up. The tablet beeped, signaling the completion of the transfer. I handed the device to Miller. Everything you need for the felony charges is in the encrypted vault folder. Miller took it, nodding once. He pushed Julian toward the sedan. The mistress appeared at the edge of the shadows, her eyes red. She realized she was alone. The firm was dead. Julian was dead. I was the only one standing. I stood up and smoothed my dress, feeling a strange, hollow sense of peace. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain. Elias stepped closer, his expression softening for the first time. Your father would be proud, Emma. You didn't just protect the money. You protected the name. I looked at the crimson folder. It contained the proof of my victory. But it also held the cost. 10 years of my life had been a lie. I was free. Julian was shoved into the back of the car. The door slammed with a definitive thud. The engine roared to life, and the sedan pulled away from the curb. Arthur stood in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by the ruins of his firm. He looked at me, his mouth hanging open. What now? He asked. I didn't owe him an answer. I turned to Elias. I want to sell the building, I said. Tonight. Find a buyer for the debt. Elias nodded and signaled to the men in suits. They moved with silent efficiency. I walked toward my father's car, leaving the broken glass and the broken men behind. As I opened the door, my phone buzzed with a new notification. It wasn't a bank alert or a missed call. It was a message from an unknown number. You think you won, but check the basement files. I froze, my hand on the handle. The game wasn't over. There was one more secret. I stared at the mysterious text, the light from the phone burning into my retinas. The black sedan carrying Julian was a fading red glow in the distance. Elias, stop, I commanded, my voice cracking the frozen night air. The executors paused, their silhouettes sharp against the city skyline. I turned back toward the shattered lobby, my heels crunching on the glass. The building felt like a tomb now. I needed to find the basement files. My father's car door remained open. The descent into the lower levels was a journey into damp, recycled air. The elevator was dead, so I took the service stairs. My flashlight beam danced over concrete walls and exposed pipes. I reached the heavy steel door marked records and pushed. It groaned, resisting me with the weight of decades. Inside, rows of metal cabinets stood like silent sentinels in the dark. I checked the unknown number again. The sender had sent a location pin. It pointed to the very back. I reached the final row, my breath hitching in the cold. A single drawer was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I pulled it open, the metal screeching against the silence. Inside was a blue folder, thick and smelling of ozone. It wasn't about the firm or the trust funds. It was a dossier on my father's final medical treatments. My hands shook as I flipped the pages. Julian hadn't just stolen money. He had been managing my father's end-of-life care. The medical logs were meticulously detailed and horrifying. I saw notes about dosages that didn't align with the hospital's official records. Julian had been the one authorized to approve changes in the palliative care plan. He had accelerated the timeline. My father didn't die of natural causes, he died because Julian needed the inheritance sooner. 6 months later, the morning sun hit my new glass desk. The high-rise office was quiet, smelling of fresh paint and expensive espresso. I was no longer the woman who stood weeping in the rain. My name was on the door now. Not as a wife, but as a founder. I opened the financial news on my tablet. Julian's trial was the lead story. He looked gray and diminished in the courtroom sketches. The monster was finally behind heavy iron bars. My first client arrived at 10 sharp. She was a young tech founder, with a brilliant patent and a husband who wanted half. I recognized the look in her eyes. It was a mixture of terror and flickering hope. I leaned back, resting my hands on the cool mahogany. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about capital and leverage. I showed her how to build a fortress around her assets. I was finally using my scars to win. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor to the lobby. Arthur Vance stood by the elevator, looking 10 years older. His firm had collapsed into a messy bankruptcy shortly after the scandal. He didn't ask for money or a job. He simply handed me a small, tarnished silver key. This was in Julian's private locker, he said quietly. Arthur looked like a man who had lost his soul to a bad investment. He left without saying another single word. I turned the silver key over in my palm. It was old and heavy. I knew exactly what it opened. I drove to the outskirts of the city, where a private storage facility sat under gray clouds. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and rust. I walked past rows of identical orange doors until I found number 42. My heart hammered against my ribs. I inserted the key and turned it. The heavy metal door groaned open. Inside the unit, a single wooden crate sat on the floor. I pried it open with a metal crowbar. My breath hitched in the cold air. It wasn't money or gold. It was a collection of my father's personal journals. They were the ones Julian claimed had been burned in the estate fire. I opened the top book and saw the date. It was from the week before he died. My father had written a message just for me. The handwriting was shaky but clear. Emma, if you are reading this, you have won. I realized then that my father had planned for my victory all along. He had left a trail of breadcrumbs for me to find when I was strong enough. But there was a final page tucked into the back. It was a map to an account Julian never found, protected by a trust structure only a blood descendant could unlock. I looked at the balance and gasped. I wasn't just a survivor. I was the architect.